Facebook, all of the things going live. So what a windstorm last night. Holy moly. When I left for the gym this morning, as I was leaving my alley, there were bins everywhere. Like blue bins, green bins, black bins. So on the way to the gym, it was like drive a car length, pick up bins, drive a car length, pick up bins. I think I picked up like 10 bins from my neighbors on the way to the gym this morning. Tried to put as many cardboard boxes back into bins as I could. Thankfully, yesterday was garbage day, so there wasn't garbage everywhere. But there were some cardboard boxes. So tried to do my best, clean up the alley. And I am so grateful that I have earplugs. That was the only way I could sleep last night, because that was something else. But there was that bit of skip of snow out there over top of that ice that melted. So please be safe out there. If you're out and about, walking, driving, cycling, please be safe. So letting you know about that. I want to talk about a few things today. I want to talk about housing and a couple things that are happening in the housing world, as non-market tax exemption. Councillor Chabot has a notice of motion around RVs as temporary housing. I want to talk just sort of generally about like the state of housing, and sort of where we're at, like progressing through the housing strategy. I want to have a conversation about that. And then I really want to talk about the importance of citizen-led committees, and the work that citizen-led committees do for the city. And then I will tie that back to council pay, because it is still in the news. It happens every January. And it's really, I think the debate that we're really having is one actually around governance. And so I really want to approach it from a governance perspective, talk to you about the process, and then talk about like if there needs to be a process change, how that process change could get brought about, but hasn't ever been brought about, and why that's really important to keep in mind. I'm also going to be with Sarah Crosby on QR later today about it, and hopefully being able to say some of the same things. So let's talk about housing. This week at Community Development Committee, with respect to changes in the provincial government, and the provincial government allowing for tax exemption, so property tax exemption for non-market or nonprofit housing providers. We have to do some changes at the city in order to enable that. And so that is coming forward. And so we got the preview of that on yesterday, Thursday at committee, and then it will come through council later this month. And this is a really good news for nonprofit housing providers. So rather than them paying property taxes, that allows them to do potentially a couple things with that money. So one, operational supports. So that could be everything from staffing. So to support residents, that could be capital money for capital upgrades. In the grand scheme of things, we're talking about probably like in the thousands of dollars for providers, a couple $1 million overall, from a tax perspective with the city of Calgary. And so I know a couple of my colleagues were concerned about sort of like the passing on of taxes like to the rest of the market. But when you do the calculations, we're looking at like pennies in the month. Whereas this is the ability for non-market housing providers to bankroll that sort of $4,000 to $10,000. And again, it depends on the unit count, but to put that money back into either like driving more development of housing, keeping that housing at a better standard, and a lot of different things. We had some concerns from a couple of my colleagues that like market providers would apply for non-market status or like nonprofit status in order to get the tax exemption. Of course, like to be a nonprofit, you have to just be more, it's more than just a status. There's a whole bunch of other regulatory environments that protect a nonprofit housing provider. And those, of course, would always be evaluated. And so to say that, you know, we're just going to see a whole bunch of like for-profit people turn into a bunch of nonprofit housing providers, is really interesting. One, because you still have to be offering like below market rent. So there's like a market rent threshold that you have to be under. So you're already now like eliminating some of your revenues, which is the whole reason why you're kind of like offsetting tax revenues. You're not actually offering rents at the same market rate. So you're not like the balance on your books is not growing or higher, and your ability to increase those rents is much lower because it's all threshold driven by median wages and average wages and a balance of a bunch of things and rents as well. So median market rent, wages, all those different things kind of come into play when you're offering non-market or below market rent. So to think that a whole bunch of like for-profit companies are going to suddenly move into the nonprofit space doesn't actually make a lot of sense. One, because they already have a whole bunch of shareholders that they're responsible to that they would no longer be able to be responsible to. They'd have to change their corporate structure. So it's really like actually not something that we can do, or that a lot of corporations would take on doing. So will we maybe get more new startups of like nonprofit housing? I don't know. I'm not sure. It's like the nonprofit world is very, very tricky and very hard. And I don't know that many people could just like naturally like move into that space. So that's one. So non-market tax exemption, that's a really big deal for housing. It's a really, really good thing. And again, this is something that's happening province-wide. It's not just a Calgary thing. So let's talk about RVs. So there is a bit of an RV community that has popped up in the city. And so these are individuals who, for one reason or another, have lost their homes and they are now living in an RV. Now, there is absolutely a movement around like RV lifestyle. Like you live in your camper van, you tour around, but like you probably don't have a job, or your job is like influencer, right? Because like that's a job now that people have these days, influencers. So they're getting paid promos and all of these other things, and they're living in their van, or they've sent up money, things like that. So that is like camper van lifestyle. We're not talking about those people. We are talking about the people who are probably working, who are probably working in a minimum wage job and who just cannot find a place to rent or a place to live, or if they've lost their home. And so they are now living in their RV. Now, through that comes a bit of a community. And absolutely. But we know that communities come in all shapes and sizes. And we know that probably those people are experiencing similar life circumstances. And so are now cohabitating together because they're probably able to help each other troubleshoot some of their problems. It's just like your neighbors. Like no one wants to move away from their neighbors. However, parking your RV on the street for extended periods of time and not being in permanent sheltered housing is not a solution. And so Councillor Chabot's notice of motion explores how the City of Calgary can create a space for those who have fallen on hard times, who are in a transition, because I think that's really important to note is like this should be a transitionary period. It shouldn't be a permanent state. That we explore how we create space for this to help out those individuals that would come with supports and services and all of those things to try to get people into permanent housing. And we have to do that, with empathy. And anyone who's needing housing, we need to approach it from an empathetic lens, understand the circumstances they are in, understand what they need to get out of it, and move through that. So as I've seen the notice of motion, I think I have a couple questions, but overall, generally sort of supportive of the idea that we know we have an issue. Ignoring the issue doesn't make the issue go away. Addressing the issue, working through the challenges, working through the potential solutions is really the best path forward. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation about that notice of motion. So that's a really big one and really important as we, continue to address the housing crisis. And when we say housing crisis, I always want to make sure that we know that it is not just about people who don't have housing. It's also about people who currently have housing but are struggling to afford that housing, so who are at risk of leaving being housed. That's a really important too. So like understanding rents and everything else. Great news coming out of Calgary. Now it's not perfect. It's not like I don't think we should be like fully celebrating yet, is that because of the number of new rental market units that are on the market. So these are things that started to get approved 2 and 3 years ago. So kudos to this council for approving housing of all kinds and new market rents that are coming on. We had one of the steepest declines in like monthly monthly rent. So that's a good news story. And it really speaks to the whole like economics of supply and demand and why we need to continue to increase housing supply across the spectrum in order to continue to keep costs down. Now, the flip side of, I know a lot of people are getting their tax assessment bill. So if you are also looking at your tax assessment bill and be like, oh my goodness, that has gone up. We also still need supply, right, in all kinds of housing. And so there is a Ask the Assessor that is coming up. So if you have questions about your assessment and why your assessment has gone up, I encourage you to go to the Ask the Assessor. If you have questions about that, you can email the ward office. If you're on Facebook, we'll drop it into the chat. When the city does assessments, we look at a number of market conditions, including sales, conditions, all of these things. I don't personally drive around and assess your house. The mayor doesn't personally drive around and assess your house. I've seen a lot of people like sort of blaming individuals about the assessment value. The assessment value is really predicated on what's happening in the market. And so in many ways, so council's fully removed from that, and administration for a big degree is really removed from that. There's some factors that we consider. We also know that typically your market assessment that you would get around property taxes is typically lower than what you would actually be selling your house for in a market condition. And so for the people whose homes have gone up 50% in 6 years, one, I say, take the positive, it's a great investment. The second part is I also know that it sucks. The flip side of that is the actual mill rate. So how much you pay per $1,000 is consistently going down. So while the property tax is going up totally, the dollars you pay per thousand is going down. That's actually a sign of efficiency. And so those two things actually should be looked at in tandem. We don't often talk about the mill rate or the percentage per $1,000 very often because people are often, right, and fairly, me too, concerned about that bottom dollar. But when we talk about driving efficiencies is how much are you paying, per $1,000 to get the same level or better of services. And right now, so that mill rate is going down. Now, if you're also seeing services go down and your mill rate is going down, it means there's sort of one of two things. We're not collecting enough to keep services at the same level, or we're decreasing services. And those are the tensions that we're kind of living in is, do we tax to keep services at the same level? Do we tax to increase services? Do we tax below it and then have to think about cutting things? These are all the decisions that council makes every single budget. And trying to keep in line with population plus inflation and recognizing that dollars are just not going as far. And those dollars are not going as far in your house. The dollars are just not going as far in the city. So I always use paving as an example. $40 million worth of paving in 2020 is not the same as $40 million worth of paving in 2025 with the cost of goods. These are all realities of being in a global marketplace and the pressures of inflation that are happening in many places. So want to talk about that. I have a few minutes left. I just very quickly want to touch on citizen-led committees, council compensation, but also another report that came that I dealt with on Wednesday with respect to Ward Boundary Commission and recommendations for changes to structures and ward offices and how that all played out. So council regularly appoints citizen committees. So people apply. We appoint citizen committees to go do some policy research for us, to take a look at the environment. So they do an environmental scan. So let's just talk about council compensation for a minute. They go out to the market. They do a jurisdictional scan on benchmarking on, representation per population. So for example, a Calgary councillor on average represents about 95,000 people. Benchmark that to an MLA, they're representing about 70,000 people. So population differences there. They benchmark against other orders of government. They benchmark against similar government. So we would look at what are Edmonton councillors getting paid? What would a Vancouver councillor getting paid, or Winnipeg or Regina? And they produce a report. They also produce a report then that talks about how should council compensation get adjusted year over year or in a period of time. And they go look at what are the best practices across the industry. They sometimes often will look and benchmark against Similar, like government institutions, they look at what's happening sort of like within the job market within the city of Calgary on average raises, and then they make a recommendation to council. And they do this every 4 years. Currently, the cycle is every 4 years because that is what is directed by council. This year, and so that process started in 2010. And I'm sorry that I don't know the process before then, but I know that process started in 2010. So here we are kind of 15 years later, we've been going through this process, and the process, the recommendation from that committee has been to adjust council pay by the change in average weekly earnings from September to September. So that worked out in this case to be about 3%. So again, this is a citizen-led committee who goes and does a jurisdictional scan, and they present this to council. So council either takes it or they don't take it. Now, if council doesn't take it, they have to come up with something different. And this is where it gets really important, where we get down to governance. We got this report in December. And in December, my council colleagues approved this. There was a few things that that people didn't want. There was a few other recommendations around transition pay. There were a few other recommendations around dismemberment. Was one that someone didn't want. They didn't want accidental death or dismemberment. I was like, I would like accidental death or dismemberment. We sometimes go on site to things. I would like that coverage if I lose my thumb. Anyways, it's nominal. It's not really the big issue here. But here's the thing. If you didn't like the process less than a month ago, it was December 17th. If you didn't like the process less than a month ago, or if you didn't like the process that we set out a year ahead of that, in other words, the council compensation committee, so the citizen-led committee, if you don't want citizens doing the research, doing the work, and making a recommendation on what council pay should be, then you shouldn't have approved the committee, and you should have come up with a different plan. So this is what it always comes down to for me when people boomerang, when suddenly it looks like we're getting a pay raise, but they haven't taken the necessary steps to put anything different in place, or they aren't looking forward to do anything different in the future. So they're being reactive, and they're politicking, and they're grandstanding rather than redefining what the governance and policy structure should be around it. So if you don't want to get a raise every year, then you need to figure out something different, and you need to bring that something different. So you then either need to give direction to that committee to set a wage for 4 years, or you need to somehow scrap the committee. Now, what's the alternative to scrapping the committee? The alternative to scrapping the committee is elected officials are deciding on their own pay, which is what we just saw happen at the provincial level. So at the provincial level, it is MLAs deciding on their own pay, and it is caucus deciding on their own pay. So it is the sitting party deciding on their own pay. There is no removal from elected officials at that level determining their own pay. And federally, it's the same things. So when you look at it from a governance perspective municipally, there are belts and braces, citizen-led committee who are making these recommendations. So if you don't like the recommendations, then you have to redefine the process. You have to build a better process. And I think that is what continually frustrates me with my colleagues is they make a show of it every single year, but they don't do the work to redefine what the process looks like. And in absence of a better process, it is elected officials deciding on their own pay, which is not good governance. It is not good for you. It is not good for us, because what are they going to decide next year if they don't want this? And so, and if you're going to continuously try to override the committee, which happens every single year, like why even appoint the committee? Why even do the work? Because administration supports it. So if you want to find cost efficiencies and savings, cool. So again, though, it comes down to governance. And so I think I'm asking you as the public, what would you like? Would you like impartial, independent citizens to make recommendations and that to be the governance structure? Or do you like elected officials to just decide on their pay every single year? Look, both options are totally viable, but there has to be a fulsome conversation on what the path forward is if this isn't what we're taking. So that's kind of my beef on governance. I would say that my further beef on governance is we had the Ward Boundary Commission make a bunch of recommendations to council that came directly, again, out of citizen conversations conversations with our staff, and conversations with counselors. And they came forward with 16 different recommendations. Now, some of them are really feasible in the short term, and some of them aren't feasible for a longer term, and we'll have to phase some of them in. But ultimately, they were recommendations that were made directly to do better citizen engagement and support through our offices. So when that report came to council, there was a whole bunch of people who just want to scrap the entire thing entirely. They were just like, we don't care that you did the work. I'm ready to dismiss this report. And I said, whoa, that's basically like a middle finger to the committee who just brought this, who just did a year's worth of work on it. We should have a fulsome conversation about this at Council Services Committee. This is where it lives. So I moved it to Council Services Committee. It came on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, I was the only person prepared to deal with the 16 recommendations. And the rest of my council colleagues who were there, who conveniently make up the community's first group, weren't prepared to deal with it. And the only thing they were prepared to do was say the same thing that they've been saying for the past 18 months, which were contained in the recommendations. But they had no idea how to move the recommendations forward into action. And if you don't want them, that's okay. Then you have to bring the plan to say, again, I don't think this is the right time, or we should table this and never return to it. But you need to have a plan to then get rid of it. So you either need to accept and give direction on the recommendations, because that's what our job is, or you need to figure out how to get rid of them. And there was none of that. And so I did the work, 16 recommendations, and all the things that counselors and our staff have been asking for. And some of those things are just like better HR practices, because we don't have great HR practices. We don't have consistent pay in our offices. And if you don't think that people don't talk, that's a big deal. And to think that someone in Ward 7 is doing different work than someone in Ward 11 or someone in Ward 2, this is just like actually fundamentally untrue. We have niche expertise in our wards, but fundamentally we're serving residents. So I would actually highly encourage everyone to go watch the Council Services Committee video to see what you could be getting in terms of good governance, or actually the total lack of governance, because we also have individuals who totally feel like their staff should be exempt from any policies altogether, who think it should be the wild, wild west. And that's not great for citizens. That is not good for governance. And I guess maybe I'm the governance nerd. Maybe I have a strong sense of justice around how we think things should be happening in our offices and the safety and the parameters that should be around there, and to create good, healthy working environments. But I was absolutely blown away and shocked that there was like zero work that had been done. We had a chair who didn't even know that there were 2 items on the agenda. And I hate to harp on my colleagues. I really don't like it, but it is becoming more and more apparent. And if you really dig into those things and watch the videos of where it's happening, who knows what they're doing and who doesn't. And again, it's not even about liking the decisions. This is just about knowing how to do the work 3 years in, and what the work is before us, and how to either move it forward or change the direction. So that's it. Stay warm. It is cold. I had hoped to just get some mountain time in, but we shall see. And that's it. That was, I'm sorry, longer than 15 minutes today. Have a good one. Wishing you all the best.